That's right, yeah. Fantastic. Great. Solutions. Humans are ingenious. And so that one, Linus, will just, you keep the chord, I'll cut the choir off. Great. Can we just go, we now pay 31, bar 31? 3, 4. We now pay our respects to you. Right, let's do that again. 19. Starting the N early. 1946, made by the Parliament, we have 6 Nobel laureates and 49 Rhodes Scholars. This university has educated 2 prime ministers, 30 ambassadors, all of whom have studied society, culture, law, and we have studied natural and physical, environmental sciences, engineering and computer science, business and commerce, and medical studies. We look up, we look down, we are all on sacred ground. We look up, we look down, we are all on sacred ground. We look up, we look down, we are all on sacred ground. We are all on sacred ground. After 75 years, we are still one, and knowledge will be our creed with compassion. Wisdom past and present, wisdom of the future. We now pay our respects to you. We look down, we look down, we are all on sacred ground. We will make you proud. We look down, we are all on sacred ground. We look down, we are all on sacred ground. We are all on sacred ground. And now, wait. Just at the end of that, there will be hopefully applause. And then they're going to move the table with the cake over here. So we need to just basically retreat a little bit so that they can do that. Maybe we'll just all all go back. And Linus, can you play us? That's an okay key. Yeah, great.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Australian National University's 75th anniversary. My name is Professor Brian Schmidt, and I'm the Vice-Chancellor of the university, a role that I have been privileged to be able to do over the last 5.5 years. Before we begin, I would like to welcome Ani Matilda and Paul House to welcome us to their country today.
I'd like to thank you all to be here today on a very special occasion. It's my occasion too, because we're celebrating 76? 75, my God. How wonderful. Right on the date that I was born. So I want to thank you for putting this on for me. I only realised it myself this morning when I got up. But we're here to do this wonderful welcome of our Canberra country and, and to make sure that this President of Canberra always will be here celebrating the Ngambri and Walgaloo people who we are. And I will talk to all the children are here, and it's so special to have children at these events, because it's them that this will live on in their eyes and their minds for such a long time. You are sitting in a wonderful country, and I want to thank the Australian National University for making this occasion to always maintain the Aboriginal presence that has always been here in this beautiful land. I'll just welcome my son up here and have a little yarn to you, and then he will do some things.
Amandangu, Wurrugawurri, thank you, Dr. Ani Matilda House. Noyagoya Malang Marambang Malang, it's wonderful, it's fabulous. Bulunina Yiradu to be here today. Baladu Yari, Ngambri, Walgaloo, Warajaniang, I speak Ngambri, Walgaloo language. Yuandu Paul House, Girawa. My name is Paul House, Girawa. Nadu, Maradu Marai Birangu, Gujigangu, Nurumbangu, Ngambri. I was born here at the centre of my ancestral country at the Old Canberra Hospital. Nadi, Maradu Marai Birangu, Hollywood, Arambi, Nurang, Ngambri, Walgaloo, Nurumbangu Dara. My mother was born on Arambi Aboriginal 32 acres camp in Hollywood Aboriginal Reserve and raised here on country, Ngambri country. Yilangalangbu, Yuria Marang, Nara Marang, Yiridu Marang, good day. Yilangalangbu, Gibabango, Wugabu, Megabu, Diranilbang, Mayin Maranya. Ladies and gentlemen, young men, young women, distinguished guests, Nyari, Njamali, Ngambri, Gumal, Walgaloo, Wallawala, Nunawa, Mujigang, Yanangbu, Jayandu. My respects to Ngambri, Walgaloo, Wallawala, Nunawa, elders past and present, Nyari, Njamarabu, Mujigango, Nurumbanjigu, and Ninya Yiridu. My respects to all people from all parts of the country. Ngambri, Walgaloo, Nunawa, Wallawala, Mayin, Maranya people, welcome you all to country. Yinjamara, to Wiradjuri word, Yinjamara, Yinjamalgiri, Yinjamarabu. It's a philosophy, it's an ideology. It means to take responsibility, it means respect, uphold, be patient, be polite, be gentle. All those good nutrients. Yinjamara, Magagiri, Biringa, Bogongu, Diranda. Respect can be found in the journey of the Bogong moths in the mountains. Yinjamara, Bala, Wallamwanga, Dabu, Murin Dabu, Banmayu, Gurungambira. Respect can be found in the grinding stones and the carved trees made long ago on country. Yinjamala, Bala, Birida, Bina, Birawurwin, Ngambri, Nulang. Respect can be found in Ngambri Creek that flows through the ANU. Mambo Warana Minyago, Wujaga Binya Wura Darago, Winningala, Go Baligo, looking to see and listening to hear and learning to understand. Our welcome to countries are made in the spirit of peace and a desire for harmony for all people of the modern ACT and surrounds. And our main aim as local custodians is to establish an atmosphere of mutual respect through the acknowledgement of our ancestors and the recognition of our rights to declare our special place in the pre and post history of the region. We have cared for Mother Earth since the dawn of time, and evidence of our occupation, our statehood, our sovereignty can be seen everywhere throughout the land. Murunwaginya Yinjamara Murunmuru Wurumbiradara, a respectful way of life, living a respectful way of life cares for country. Yinjamara Wurumbira Marandugobo, Giyiragobo, Yandagobo. Respect is taking responsibility for the now, the past, the present, and the future. Nadu Wurugabigi, Balabambo Gobo, Balagi Bangobo, Going Goliala, Dambali now, Muraway Marambo. I listen to the old people and they show us the right path. Going Goliala, Walamali now, Yamamali now, Bilangali now. The old people show us the right way, they protect us, they guide us, they assist us, and they take care of us. So in conclusion, I'd like to say it's wonderful to be here on country, to be able to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the ANU. I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Brian Schmidt, Vice-Chancellor, and all the ANU staff, everyone, all the team, all the alumni. Yinjamara, Maramara Ni and Yinya Girama Maranya. So respect shapes us and lifts up the people. Before I go, I just want to play a welcome song in the Yadaki. And I'd love to invite 3 people up. Come and play the tap and sticks with me with this welcome song to celebrate this wonderful occasion, the 75th anniversary. So please come up and join me with a welcome song for country. So, thank you very much. Noyagoy Malang Marang Bamalang. It's wonderful and it's fabulous. Yinjamara Burai Guda. So respect is in the little children, and respect is respecting your little children. Follow me. Excellent work, thank you.
Well, thank you, Ani Matilda and Paul, for that wonderful welcome to country. And it was great to be able to bring the upcoming generations in there. So thank you for our brave volunteers who are coming up and a brave father as well. Well done. In that spirit, I would like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal Ngambri people, the first Australians and custodians of this lands for millennia, on whose traditional lands we meet, pay my respects to elders past and present. It is great that we're able to celebrate our 75th anniversary here in Cambry today, the heart of the campus, which of course means meeting place. It was gifted, the name Cambry, by the 4 indigenous communities in the ACT. It is a special place, a beautiful place, and I would like to welcome, as Vice-Chancellor, you all to our wonderful campus, and I thank those communities for gifting us that name, because it is truly special. It is a pleasure today to not just have our staff and students, but the whole extended community, from Canberra, alums, former staff members. It is a time of celebration and reflection, both forward and into the future, as I'll talk about. As the 12th Vice-Chancellor of ANU, I have had the opportunity to think a lot about our history, and I am honored to be here with you today to celebrate what is a truly significant milestone for this institution. On this day, 75 years ago, may I say, 1 year after Ani Matilda was born, ANU was established by an act of federal parliament. We are the only national university in Australia. We were founded in a spirit of post-war optimism to help solve the complex and indeed urgent problems our society faced the aftermath of World War II. The nation wanted to recover on its terms from a global crisis. Now, more than ever, as Australia's national university, it is up to us at this institution to work with our colleagues across Canberra, across the nation, and around the region and world to help navigate the disruption as we emerge from yet another global crisis. Our mission remains critical. We are here to serve our community and our nation, and we strive to continue to do this through our research, through our education, and through our informing public policy. It is up to us to nurture the future leaders of Australia. And when I say leaders, I don't just mean prime ministers. I mean people who go out and are excellent at whatever they choose to do. Our education is about empowering people, bringing people together across this nation, our region, and the world to have a great experience where they can learn not just from our professors, but from each other. So as we nurture these future leaders, it is they who are going to go and help solve problems, challenges, and create opportunities for the decades to come. It is easy to worry about the present. I worry about it every day, and I'm sure all of you do. But there is great cause for optimism because we have within this institution and institutions like us the capability of creating a great future. It really is ours to do. And in this time, it needs institutions like our universities to be optimistic, to take the charge and say there is a good future out there and to work towards it. Our achievements and contributions over the last decades would not have been possible without the support and involvement of our community. So I do see the university having had a remarkable last 75 years, but there is so much to learn and think about what we have done and what we have not done, what we have done well and what we have not done so well. And one of those things is involving a broader set of people in our work, our communities, people across all of Australia, so we truly reflect our nation and not be seen as an ivory tower of not being relevant in certain parts of the community. We are here for everyone. Our community has helped create an environment for the exchange of knowledge. This is a place where big ideas are discussed, solutions are thought through and helped created and helped pushed, and we work towards changing the world for better. That is really what we are here for. Knowledge to make the world a better place. And this Community Day is the start of our year-long celebration to honor the university's 75 years. And I do encourage you all to get involved and see those contributions over time, reflect on them, and think about what we're going to do, not just for the next 75 years. Universities should last for millennia. So let's think a long time in the future. Almost no other institution does think more than, quite frankly, the next 2 or 3. And so we are charged to think 10, 50, 100, even 1,000 years. In my case, I even go hundreds of trillions of years in the future, but maybe not quite as useful. So today we're going to be launching our Living History Project at 12:45 here in Manning Clark Hall. And it features a panel of our academics who will discuss ANU then and now, and 75 years from now. So I encourage you to all come along. You never know what you might learn there. It's going to be a very entertaining group of people. Now, I'd like to hand over to our Chancellor, who is joining us from Perth, not her choice, I can assure you, to say a few words. Julie?
Thank you, Brian, our Vice-Chancellor, and Paul and the children and Auntie Matilda for that gracious welcome to country. And Auntie Matilda, happy birthday. You're a great friend of our institution. Yes, I'm joining you from Perth on Whadjuk land of the Noongar people, and I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. While I'm really disappointed I couldn't be in Canberra to celebrate with you, I am delighted to be here today virtually and in spirit. Today is an opportunity to reflect on past achievements and to look ambitiously towards the future. Over the past 75 years, Australia's first and only national university has achieved some extraordinary things. We continue to undertake world-class research, which has positively impacted our nation and the world around us. For ANU was founded with a mission of helping to tackle the challenges across every facet of our lives. Governments have looked to our experts to craft sound, evidence-based policy that achieves our national goals. Our scientists have been relied upon to advance the disciplines that help us progress. Our creative talent has nurtured our souls, and our economists have helped our nation prosper. The events of the past 18 months demonstrate our impact. ANU experts have been at the forefront of this response to the pandemic. From our epidemiologists and psychologists shaping health policy to our international relations and business experts who have explored the question, where to from here? We have helped lead our nation as we recover. ANU continues to nurture future leaders through our teaching and knowledge sharing. We continue to build on our world-class student experience, which nurtures many more remarkable leaders in business, government, and across our communities. Our incredible impact over the past 75 years is one of the many reasons I'm proud to be Chancellor. Seeing so many of you in celebration of our 75th anniversary reflects the value and meaning of our mission. Our community enables the environment for our world-class research and teaching, and for that, I thank you all. The spirit of this university is in its people, who improve the lives of fellow Australians and the communities from which our international students are drawn. I'm honoured to be part of this institution and look forward to seeing how our future leaders shape the next 75 years. Happy birthday to ANU. Back to you, Brian.
And thank you, Chancellor. It is a shame you're not here to help me cut and eat the cake, but Auntie Matilda, I know, is going to help me with that. And given it's her birthday, I think probably very appropriate. To honor this special occasion, we are now going to invite Tobias Cole and the Chamber Choir, who are going to perform a special piece for us, written by our own Kim Cuneo.
In 1946, made by the Parliament, we have 6 Nobel laureates and 49 Rhodes Scholars. This university has educated 2 prime ministers, 30 ambassadors, all of whom have studied society, culture, law and legal studies, natural and physical, environmental sciences, engineering and computer science, business and commerce, health and medical studies. We look up, we look down, we are all on sacred ground. We look up, we look down, we are all on sacred ground. We look up, we look down, we are all on sacred ground. We are all on sacred ground.
All right, Auntie Matilda, we're going to see how good we are at cutting a 4-kilo, 6-layer chocolate cake. I've been told the Chancellor is very good at this, but anyway. All right, I think we should try it together. Let's go down. You ready? 1, 2, 3. Oh, it looks very good. All right. Uh-oh, I feel like I hit the bottom, which means I think I have children again, but. Thank you, Bella, for this. Now we have 1,500 cupcakes to share out in the foyer. So that'll be the best way to celebrate this cake, is eating a bit of it. And I encourage everyone to come along to the event at 12:45 here on our history. Some of the other pop-up talks. Thank you to the choir. Thank you, Kim Cuneo. It was very special. Really appreciate it. And enjoy our collective birthdays. Happy birthday, Auntie Matilda. Happy birthday, ANU. Thank you, everyone. Welcome, everyone. Sorry we're running a few minutes late, but we had to have time to eat those cupcakes. I hope you had a couple. Certainly enough for everyone to have more than one, which I encourage you to have. So welcome again to our 75th anniversary. And it is indeed a pleasure to be able to preside as our 12th Vice-Chancellor of the Australian National University. We had a wonderful welcome to country just previously, but I'd like to acknowledge that welcome and acknowledge the Ngunnawal Ngambri people whose traditional lands we're meeting on today, people who have been here for almost 20 or more than 20 millennia. And I do thank everyone for coming out here to celebrate on a special day in our university's history, and you're in for a real treat, a treat that is bringing some of the thoughts of today and reflecting on the past and the future. Our distinguished panel, thank you for coming along, and I'll just briefly introduce Professor Genevieve Bell, Professor Nicholas Brown, Professor Ann McGrath, and Professor Mark Kenny, who is going to moderate an unmoderatable session, would be my guess, knowing this crew. I'd also like to give a special welcome and shout out to Dr. Daniel Oakman, who will be launching our Living History project at the end of this event. Daniel has done an absolutely excellent job at curating our university's history over the past 75 years and creating opportunities for us all to release our inner historian by contributing our stories. And if you have a story, get on and contribute it. It's an important time for ANU. We were founded in the wake of a global crisis, and certainly we are in the amongst of a global crisis today. We were founded to provide optimism and knowledge, a resource for the nation, and that is certainly true for the current times as well. Our academics remain at the forefront, providing expertise and advice that advances science, influences policy making, and helps understand the nature of things, the foundational knowledge that underpins everything we do, whether it be in political science, history, or quantum mechanics. First, to know the nature of things is our motto, and it is as true today as it was then, even if our Latin scholars have to argue on twos and commas a little bit on that. We all know what Lucretius meant when he said it, and we know what it means today. Once you know the nature of things, you can truly start to solve problems, chart ways forward in a complex world of wicked problems, whether it be the complex challenges that we face today on the world scene, or perhaps just opening up a crack of opportunity that brings prosperity in ways that no one ever dreamed before that thought emerged. Our distinguished panel here today will demonstrate the incredible work and breadth of our National University. Genevieve Bell and her team at the new Cybernetics School and the 3A Institute are creating a new type of engineer not yet seen before that make robots feel guilty. That is the primary aim. Cybernetics, hopefully Genevieve will try to explain to you exactly what cybernetics means, because it's a term of when we were founded 75 years ago, but it's not a term we've thought of, and yet we are immersed in that concept every day of our lives. Professor Nicholas Brown, a historian focusing on Australia's economic development, World War II, and the Cold War, seems very perfectly suited for thinking about the past as hopefully not quite the future, but maybe the future we want to avoid. He's been thinking about major transformations across the 20th century. And finally, Professor Ann McGrath is working with communities to learn more about our deep human past through Indigenous Australians. We need to understand our history so that we can learn to do better in the future. We want our historians, of which are out in force today, to help us do better. And I have always been a great lover of history because it's kind of, as an experimental scientist, it's sort of the only experiments we have as humans. And it's good to know the good and the bad. So I'm looking very much forward to hearing our discussion as well as having the launch of our Living History project. So thank you to our speakers. And I'd like now to hand over to Mark Kenny, fresh from Insiders, up on stage here to convene this unconvenable panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian, for that reminder of a busy morning that I've had. And thanks to all of you for turning out here to discuss ANU then, now, and 75 years from now, which is, let's face it, a pretty big topic. Before we start, please note that this session is being recorded and that hopefully there will be time for some audience questions. Now, I'm told there was going to be a microphone at one side of the stage or other, and I'm not sure whether that's still the case, but certainly the way I've written it out here in my little script, I was going to mention to you that if that is the case, then you can line up behind it to ask a question. We'll hopefully have some time to do that. And I was going to say, don't touch the microphone, which is going to be a lot easier if there isn't one. If that is the case, and we'll just see how things pan out, but if that is the case, then I guess we'll just try and maybe if you could come forward and I'll make sure that everyone else can hear. I might have to repeat the question just so that people at the back can hear what the question was. Can I add my acknowledgement to the original custodians of the land on which we meet and note that it was never ceded, which only adds to the clear moral case for a process of truth-telling and treaty-making. And let me say, I can think of no singular initiative that would do more to unlock this country's future than to reconcile properly with its past and to, as I say, usher in what I would hope would be a new and fuller version of nationhood than we've been able to achieve thus far, notwithstanding that nationhood around the time of the Olympics seems like a pretty vibrant sort of concept. Certainly one hopes that before 75 years have passed from now, that process of truth-telling and treaty-making and recognition will have occurred. And you know what? I actually feel very confident about that, because one of the things I've noticed about young people is that they are less invested in protecting institutions that are themselves not willing to shape up to the past, that are themselves carrying a kind of internal hypocrisy, and we can all think of some institutions like that. Now, I've been thinking a lot about courage and vision lately in the lead up to this, and of course to think 75 years past, as Brian has mentioned and as others have mentioned and sure we'll discuss in this panel, 75 years ago this country was emerging out of the horrors and deprivations of World War II, and to think that our policymakers were so inclined as to be thinking about enlarging the nation, enlarging it intellectually, asserting Australia into the world and establishing Australia's profile in the world, it seems like a far cry from perhaps sending a minister overseas to lobby so that the Great Barrier Reef doesn't get listed, or dragging the chain on climate change as we did at a climate change conference in Naples only a few days ago. So let's hope that there is some lessons that we can take from today that will inform a more robust and creative sort of Australia. So let me bring the guests up to the panel in no particular order. Please come forward, and I'll just introduce you as you do. Professor Genevieve Bell, she's the Director of the School of Cybernetics, as Brian said, the Director of the 3A Institute, and the Florence Violet Mackenzie Chair at ANU. She's best known for her work at the intersection of cultural practice and technology development, and widely recognised as an influential voice within academia, industry and government. And that's quite something. Professor Nicholas Brown on the end. He's a Professor of the School of History in the College of Asia and the Pacific. Nicholas's research covers several areas of Australian history with a particular focus on 20th century political, social and cultural history, cultural change. And last but not least, Professor Ann McGrath. She's the W.K. Hancock Chair of History at ANU. She's the Director of the Research Centre for Deep History, and Kathleen Fitzpatrick, ARC Laureate Fellow 2017 to 2022. And she has a very strong interest in deep history, and I'm eager to hear a bit more about that, as Brian mentioned as well, and spatial history. So there's a bit to talk about here. So, as I take my seat, I might invite you, Nick, to perhaps paint us a bit of a picture of that world, that place that Australia was at the end of the Second World War, which led to a consensus around the idea of a national university with all of the shining aspirations associated with that.
Thank you. Really happy to do that. As several people have mentioned, including Brian as Vice-Chancellor, this is the foundation of the ANU grows directly out of the Second World War. It grows directly out of the concept of post-war reconstruction, which was not just particular to Australia, but motivated so many nations coming out of the Second World War. Why? Because they were coming out of an interwar period of incredible privation. They've endured a war that created huge moral, physical, technological challenges to humanity. So that's a familiar enough story, but I suppose I want to add a couple of more local elements to this. Canberra at the end of the 1930s was a really desolate place. In many ways, it's only the Second World War that rejuvenates the sense that there is a role for a national capital here that might define the new ambit of national government. If you look at those photographs of Canberra at the end of the Second World War, if you look at those first founders of the ANU kind of just up on the hill there in Black Mountain looking over this site, it is bare, it is empty. You know, Parliament House kind of looks like a wedding cake in a desolate wheat field, or sheep paddock really. So that's the first point, a commitment to a national capital at the end of the Second World War and a university as an integral part of that commitment, I think is worthwhile emphasising. Secondly, it's a Labor Party that pushes this through. Now, in saying that, I don't mean this to be a partisan comment, because as so many people make a comment about that 1940s Labor Party. It's not the Hawke Labor Party, it's not really even the Whitlam Labor Party. This is a Labor Party of the workers. And it took a lot of persuasion to get that Labor Party to embrace the idea that there was a role in Canberra, in national government, not just for a university, but for a research-only university. And it really came down to the power of figures like Nugget Coombs, H.C. Coombs, John Crawford, several other young men, remarkably young men, who found their opportunity in government during the Second World War to make the case for a very distinctive kind of university to a Labor Party which really rose above its own instincts to some extent in saying, yes, this is absolutely central to post-war reconstruction. I suppose the third point that I want to make in setting that scene, it's become really fashionable recently in historical circles to kind of minimise post-war reconstruction or to emphasise the way in which so many of the ideals that came out of post-war reconstruction, a making of a new order, were kind of compromised or written down, certainly after 1949. One of the enduring symbols of post-war reconstruction is this university and the level of bipartisan support that this university was able to strike. So just think about that in terms of the context. A really barren landscape for this city, which was about to be enormously transformed. A really big hurdle for a party that thought it represented class conflict to embrace the idea of a unifying national university, but also for that fundamental commitment to a university which in its structure embodied the promise of post-war reconstruction, a better world, and identified that, I suppose, in two really striking ways. We need research expertise to define what that world might look like, and we need research expertise in specific areas, those 4 foundational research schools for the ANU. Physics, again, bringing back Mark Oliphant to try and map out what a world which has been fundamentally transformed by atomic energy might be. Pacific Studies, to face up to the fact that we are now a part of the Asia-Pacific region, so we need to know something about it. Medicine, to build again on the skills of enormously proficient expatriate scientists to bring them back here and remake an agenda for social change that recognises health, nutrition, things that we really now see in a very raw way before us. What does it mean to be competent in keeping your population healthy? And fourthly, social sciences, to take seriously that what the world would require in the 40s, 50s and 60s is understanding how societies worked, their economics, their demography, their history, their politics, their sociology, to take seriously the idea that you needed expertise on those crucial areas of social progress. So those, I suppose, in addition to the big picture of the ANU, I think are those very particular elements that the university still honours.
Thanks, Nick. I think you'd all be aware of the observation of Barry Humphries when he said, Australia is the Brisbane of the world. I'm starting to think that Canberra might have been the Garima place of Australia. You know, barren, and you know that's the image that came to my mind.
It's a place that very few people wanted to come, which
yes.
makes attracting international experts to Canberra all the more remarkable.
Yeah, like I said, very much like Garima Place, yeah, really. Especially at night. And Nick makes the point that the Labor Party was the party of the workers at the time. It was also the party of men, wasn't it? I mean, it was an entirely different atmosphere, really, than the one we have now.
Yes, can you hear me? Yes. I have been reading the letters of W.K. Hancock in the Noel Butlin archives, and in the year 1948, he must have written at least 10 letters about the problem for the wives of the men that he was trying to attract. And I think that, you know, it's easy for us to look at some of the things that were said and think that, you know, they're amusing, whatever. But it was actually a very serious situation for these women. A lot of them were highly qualified, like, for example, Theodore Brocklebank, who was W.K. Hancock's wife. She had honours degrees and had done diplomas and so forth. And all the women were saying, why would we want to go to a place that had no theatres, no music, no nothing, no libraries, and no domestic service? That was the real sticking point. And in at least 8 letters, Hancock brings up the topic, and he became very frustrated because he realised that the council was not taking it seriously. And he said, well, why should the wives be drudges? A lot of them are social scientists, they're intellectuals, they've got all these skills. The sad thing was, they all knew they were not going to get a job. And, you know, that's the thing, that's why they needed to ask what they could do. And in the case of his own wife, Theodore, he said that she would work for free. She would do social surveys, she would research history, she would work for the ABC because she had been a broadcaster for the BBC. But every time, he courageously, I must say, raised this in so many letters, and eventually he just got furious and he said, I don't feel the council is taking this matter seriously. And then he also suggested a woman who was a brilliant town planner who would be an excellent appointee, actually member of the academic staff. This was ignored. He mentioned the principal of Frensham would be a wonderful member of the interim council, ignored. So, you know, as much as I absolutely am very proud to be part of this university, and I've had the privilege of meeting some of the wonderful founding scientists, you know, like Frank Fenner. Who could not think of him these days? You know, I've still got a smallpox vaccination scar. The young generation doesn't have to worry about that. Like, he actually chaired the board that, you know, and successfully as a microbiologist, you know, cured most of the world totally of smallpox. And, you know, these great achievements, and, you know, Howard Florey and penicillin, and, you know, they're just these wonderful things they did. And not all the men were of this view about women, but the fact is women had been involved in lots of valuable high professional employment during World War II. And so it was a sad time when they were being told to be drudges. And he actually stuck in the home. So there's a bit of a happy ending to the story in that I don't think any of the women got domestic servants. But they did get nice homes that they were able to pick, and they were able to get architect-designed homes on nice blocks of land. And there's a free ANU book about this called Experiments in Modern Living, and the fact that my husband wrote it's got nothing to do with it because we get no royalties. But, you know, that's another wonderful thing about ANU, that you can actually download all these wonderful books and wonderful scholarly books for free all around the world, you know. But that, so anyway, just the end of the story is ANU is trying to do quite a lot about gender balance, but in 1983, in the Institute for Advanced Studies, there were only 6% women, and out of 254 people in 1989, there were only 6 tenured women. So.
Yes, so it's very much a work in progress. Genevieve, in that very famous second reading speech that John Dedman gives in Parliament, he says many great things about the aspirations of creating this national university that I and Brian referred to in the introduction, but there is also that gendered aspect in it very strongly as well, where he talks about the aspiration of getting the right man for the job, who's ideally an excellent administrator and hopefully an excellent researcher or academic as well, so that that man can attract all the other brilliant men that are scattered around the world. It's unconsciously male, of course. I mean, at the time, they wouldn't have seen it like that. To them, that was just the natural state of things, but it was so gendered.
I'm not sure it was unconscious. When I think, there's a way of saying that kind of notion of homosocial reproduction, that the only people that are good are people who look like us, sound like us, think like us. Coincidentally, we know that's men.
Well, let me be clear, I'm not making an excuse for it.
Well, but at that point, I think you can look at multiple other places and say there were different kinds of conversations unfolding, and you can say, did they imagine they were discriminating against people who were equal to them? Well, then you have to ask the question of how were they constituting equal to them? So I think it's, on one hand you can say, sure, that's what it looked like in 1947, but we know it didn't always look like that everywhere else. And we know that there were other kinds of conversations unfolding in other places. I mean, Brian, you challenged me, could I define cybernetics? So here we'll go. So 1946, same time those conversations are happening in Australia. I'm not sure I'd want to describe Canberra as barren. Maybe it was to us. I'm pretty certain to the traditional owners of this place, they wouldn't have thought of it that way. But sitting in New York City at the same time those conversations are going on here, in the Panhellenic Hotel on the Lower East Side, a whole collection of thinkers were gathered, men and women, scientists and social scientists, people from the humanities, the public policy and the arts. They too were convening in the shadow and the long consequence of World War II. There also was a moment of optimism of saying, we have a place and a time when we could create a future that didn't look like the past we've just had. That particular collection of people, who include John von Neumann, so the man who invented the ENIAC, so world's first computer, Norbert Wiener, who would go on to be a principal architect of artificial intelligence and robotics at MIT, but also Margaret Mead and Gregory Bateson, who are kind of the leading lights in American anthropology, as well as a collection of philosophers and psychologists, took it upon themselves to say computers and technology had made a level of destruction in World War II possible that had been hitherto unimaginable. That what computers did through the arc of the war was aim guns and kill people, and that the power of computing was only going to increase. And so for them the question became, could we imagine a future with computing in human society that wasn't about mass destruction? And when they gathered for a series of conversations that were about what would it mean to say we could control technology, that we could put humans in the role of steering that technical system, but oh, by the way, that technical system was always and already a human system sitting inside an ecology. So the short definition of cybernetics would be a way of imagining a system that's always and already human, cultural and ecological. That's the theory of it. The praxis of it was that you couldn't manage, design, regulate, control, disrupt that system unless you had a diversity of voices in the room, unless you're willing to commit to a conversation that would unfold over multiple iterations. And I think most importantly, unless you imagined that that system and the world that it would build had a politic. Not a politics, but a politic. And when I think about the parallel between that conversation in New York City, which then spurs and creates artificial intelligence, the beginning of the web, the children of that moment go on to hold incredibly pivotal roles all over the world. I look at that moment of saying we're going to build a different world, a world that is consciously and deliberately not like the one that we have just left. A conversation that was curated with a sort of optimism and also with the notion that you should build things, not just critique them. That for me feels like that conversation in New York and the conversation here in Canberra are part and parcel of a same moment in time. And so it's nice for me 75 years later to get to bring those conversations together because they really haven't been in dialogue before. But there were certainly things about that conversation in 46 deliberately curated and consciously curated for a diversity of voices that did actively include women. It included people from all over the world, so it wasn't just the Americans, it was also the Brits, but it was also people from Latin and Southern America, from Asia. And there was something really about saying, maybe what we need to start with is a conversation, and maybe in the having of the conversation, we can break open this moment just a little bit and see a different kind of future.
It's interesting because I guess the speech, Deadman's speech, will have been given to a House of Representatives with, I suspect, 2 members within it, perhaps only 1 female member in the House at that time. We're talking 1946. Virginia House, can probably tell me, but she no doubt will. 1, she's telling. Yes, that's right. 1, yes. So yes, it was kind of the full horizon of the people who are making those speeches. But at the same time, there's at least this this gesture, this invitation to broaden everyone's horizons. And you've just outlined very well how many other people were thinking about these kinds of developments and what it would bring. You've given us a pretty good explanation of cybernetics. You mentioned about the technology that had emerged in the Second World War and which had had a destructive force. Brian mentioned in his opening remarks the goal of making technology feel guilty. Are we getting there yet?
Sometimes. Not fast enough. So I think, the running joke we've had inside the Innovation Institute that I founded and ran for the first 3 years of its life, and now the School of Cybernetics, we've really been kind of trying to puzzle through that notion. If a new technical system arises, do you need a new set of tools and talents and questions to tackle that system? Does it necessitate or in some ways call for the invention of something else? And so if you look across the history of particularly academic disciplines, many of the ones that sit on the applied side, so whether that's electrical engineering, civil engineering, computer science, those arose as a response to a technical system coming into being where the previous skills weren't enough to manage it, where before civil engineering, it was quite hard to think about what it would mean to take a railway to scale. Before computer scientists, we didn't have a language at a sufficient level of abstraction to talk to computers. And if you look at the current moment we find ourselves in with advances in computation, you could call it artificial intelligence, or at least a bundle of technologies that propose to behave in a very different way. My team and I would say we need a different set of skills to manage that, right? Not to replace the ones we have, but to supplement and augment them. So 3.5 years ago, I, not glibly, I think foolishly declared, we'll build a new branch of engineering to take AI safely, responsibly and sustainably to scale. How hard can that be? Turns out harder than it looks. Turns out, however, not impossible. And in part of that, it really was about how do you think about bringing together the building block skills for the system, the AI system, as well as the building block skills for the social and the ecological systems, because how do you navigate between all of those things, right? It's not about turning people into computer scientists or engineers or anthropologists, God forbid, plenty of those around. But it is about equipping people to be in conversations across all of those things. Because when I think back to the cybernetics conferences in the 1940s and 1950s, Margaret Mead, so well-known American anthropologist, kind of important in the socializing of anthropology outside of the discipline. 30 years after that first conference, she and Gregory Bateson, at this point they've been long divorced, but an amicable, complicated divorce, they're sitting at his kitchen table being interviewed by Stuart Brand, one of the early editors of The Well, creator of the Whole Earth Catalogue. Some of you will remember that. And Stuart basically says to them, what do you remember about this event now 30 years ago? And Bateson goes on and on and on about, what he was talking about, and Mead just finally skewers him and says, well, of course you think all of that, Gregory. You were at the head table. Now, let me tell you what I was doing, because we were actually making it all work, right? And she says the only reason those conversations survived was that there were scientists who liked to run the world in a very precise way, social scientists who knew that's what the scientists were doing and could disrupt them. And then she says, and in the middle there were 2 or 3 people who were loose gossips and had almost no discipline whatsoever. They're journalists, as it turns out, and psychologists. And she believed that those people were the ones who held the whole conversation together, right? That in order to make an interdisciplinary moment, you needed to both have a strong grounding in a field yourself, an understanding of someone else's field, and a willingness to imagine that there had to be a conversational space created in the middle, and that required curation. Something I think Nugget probably knew quite well in bringing all those voices together.
Yes, exactly. I think that sense of synchronicity or synthesis was very much a part of the original design of the ANU. We tend to think about it as a series of separate institutions, but the people who were building it, even if we go back to Walter Burley Griffin's original concept of what the ANU should look like, it was an organic university. It was supposed to be talking amongst itself, because there was a realization, I think, that this was a new conversation. Again, it's hard to emphasize enough. This is a distinctive university. There was no other university like it in Australia. Arguably, there are very few other universities like it in the world, prepared to commit to the notion of highly selective areas of research that would have the capacity to talk to each other for the sake of social reform. And
the amount of money that was associated with doing it was quite considerable.
Yes.
As I say, that's part of the vision thing, really, the courage and the vision to actually commit money, particularly at a time when debt to GDP, as I was writing about yesterday in the Canberra Times, was 120%, which is considerably higher than it is now. And yet that government decided to borrow money further for this whole sort of new initiative, and that's really quite impressive.
it is impressive, and I certainly take Genevive's point about no, not a barren landscape for all, but if you look at those early buildings at the ANU, they're recycled weatherboard huts that are left over from the 1920s. This is not an opulent campus, and really until the mid-1960s. And again, it's the endurance of these figures who are coming from around the world to define this new concept, which at a basic human level I think is so striking.
And what's the... Can you paint a more... comprehensive picture, I suppose, of what it was like for some of the really landmark early scholars of ANU, the female scholars I'm thinking of in particular?
Well, as I said, there weren't many, but a lot of them were around, but they didn't have jobs. And so I'd like to be a bit nostalgic about my first trip to the Australian National University, which is jumping ahead a few decades to 1978-9. And I think I must have been looking a little bit lost, and someone in a car, a woman in a car, pulled up and she said, "Can I help you?" And I said, "Yes, I'm looking for this particular library." And I introduced myself, and it was Amira Inglis, and I was starstruck because I'd just read her wonderful book about women's history in Papua New Guinea. Of course, ANU had that link with Papua New Guinea. I also was a great admirer of her husband, Ken Inglis. And on this trip, I also met Bill Stanner, who'd actually read my first publication in advance, and he was a great anthropologist who, this wonderful concept of everywhen, which we're using quite a lot. Well, it's an Indigenous concept, but he was sort of discussed the matter and has had a big influence, and now Indigenous people today are trying to explain their temporality as an everywhen, past, present and future all together, which is really important for our Centre for Deep History and the very interdisciplinary take that we're working with Aboriginal people and scientists to break down some of the walls around history and the idea that started with Captain Cook or whatever. But getting back to that 1978 trip, I also met Diane Barwick, who was one of the founding people of Aboriginal history, as of course was Genevieve's mum. But it was very interdisciplinary, that journal, and it also brought in Indigenous knowledge, translations by linguists of brilliant legends that Aboriginal people had shared with them. And I also met Gordon Briscoe, a Pitjantjatjara man, who was ended up being ANU's first PhD in history. So it was just such an exciting atmosphere. It was fantastic. And in those days, PhD students didn't have any money, so you're always staying with a friend of a friend or something. And I also met Peter Reid, who was starting his marvellous work on stolen children. This was all on this trip as a researcher, a PhD researcher, so I was quite starstruck by how exciting it was at ANU. And then these friends of friends said, "Oh, we're going to drive off to one of our friends' places. Do you want to come for the ride?" So I said, yeah, I'll come for the ride. And little did I know they were doing a dope deal. It was they were buying marijuana from, scoring, as we used to call it in those days.
And what do you mean, little did you know?
She had a
Little did
PhD, but she didn't know that.
Little did I know that one of the other guests there at this house was Nugget Coombs. So I got to meet Nugget, and of course, what was he talking about? He was talking to Peter Willis, who I believe was a Jesuit priest who was finishing a thesis. And was he a Jesuit? Yes, yeah. Yeah. Anyway, apparently he's not a Jesuit anymore. But anyway, of all the topics, Nugget was talking about how government had to really listen to Aborigines, and he was such a humble man who was basically saying, I don't think we've really listened to them properly yet. And, what important, memorable words that was, and such, a great thinker, expansive mind, always wanting to learn from others, just... and to think that he helped build this institution, that's, I think, pretty inspiring.
Well, of course, marijuana's always had a bit of a relationship with Canberra, which is interesting. It reminds me, actually, of that hilarious story that occurred when, you might recall, Daniel Johns, the lead singer of Silverchair, at some stage, this was several years ago, mentioned somewhere in some interview that he had been sitting around smoking dope with Peter Garrett. And Peter Garrett was, at the time, a minister in the federal government, and I don't think fully appreciated this reference being made. Anyway, it became something of a story, mainly in the tabloid press. And Nick Minchin was still around in those days, and he was speaking at the National Press Club, and he was asked a question. I have a feeling it might have been by me, but my memory could be wrong on that. And I literally mean that. I'm not entirely sure whether I did ask the question or not.
Because if it wasn't you, you wished it was you?
Well, yeah, I do wish it was me, because it was a very good question, and it certainly brought about a hilarious moment, because the question was, you were at Bergman Hall with Peter Garrett in the days as an undergraduate at ANU. Do you remember much dope smoking going on? And Minchin, to his credit, said, well, I don't remember seeing Peter there, but there was a fair bit of smoke in the room. So he obviously gave away the somewhat ludicrous idea of I didn't inhale, as Barack Obama did once later on when he was asked about it, and he said, well, of course I inhaled, that was the point. Let's turn to the unique role that ANU has with the public service and with the government, because it does mark it out as quite a different university from all of the others, and there weren't that many, of course. There was only 7 other universities, or maybe not even that at the time that ANU was created. There's something like 39 now, but ANU does have that particular thing in its charter to have a relationship with government and with the federal public service, and to play a role in training and so forth. Genevieve, how has that affected the character, do you think, of the institution?
I think there's something particular about a university that is a national project. So the ANU is a national university. It's not a state university. It was founded not just with a notion of optimism, but with an idea that it would build capacity for government in its first instance. It really was about how do we ensure that our best and our brightest don't go to Oxbridge, and how do we not have to import the best and the brightest from somewhere else. So there was a piece where it was a national project to create a technocratic class, an educated one, that would help steer Australia forward, right? And I think that was a very particular kind of foresight of understanding what government would need. I think, over the last 75 years, we've seen that enacted in lots of different ways. There is something about being a university that is co-present in the nation's capital. We know that to this day, many people who serve across the public service, including in very senior roles, have come through the ANU. We know that it is part and parcel of our job to be in dialogue with all of those different questions and competencies. I know at various points we give advice, not always, I'm sure, the advice that people wish for. I think we also have a responsibility to be a check, as part of a check and balance system, of saying, is that really a data-driven policy? Is that really a fair and just policy? Is that really a policy that has enough of a kind of base in either theory or praxis? And increasingly, I think there's a piece here about how we push too. I think, even 75 years ago, the idea that we would build capacity for government meant that we also had to have a point of view about what government needed. And I think these days that should also be part and parcel of the challenge as well as the work. But that means you also need to think very differently about how we do education. I think, 75 years ago, the idea that you could take 3-5 years and go spend it somewhere may be less true. I think how we think about shorter credentialing experiences, how we think about creating places for people to have other kinds of conversations and skills all feels like that's part of our responsibility too. That government has evolved in 75 years and we need to too. But I do think it's an uneasy relationship.
I'd like to come in on that, because
Yes,
I think
by all means,
it
Nick.
is an uneasy relationship, and it always has been, I think. I mean, even if you go back, the W.K. Hancock chair that you occupy, I mean, Hancock was in a very difficult position as one of the first architects of the ANU, because he's a historian, he has had some involvement in the British government during the Second World War, but he is very much a scholar, and he defines himself as an eminent British, historian in a British context. And he always wrestled with the idea that there should be some direct chain of accountability between what the ANU was doing as a research university in association with government and as an international research university that had to maintain the highest standards of scholarship. And increasingly, I think, through the 50s and 60s, you do get a lot of pushback, I think, from the ANU, and Coombs certainly regretted this sense by the early 1960s that the ANU was starting to define itself primarily in terms of its international excellence rather than in terms of its policy relevance. And that is, I'm sure Brian would agree, I mean, that is an enduring tension within this university that's been negotiated in different ways with varying levels of success all the way through the 75 years. Partly what's, I think, fascinating about what you can learn through looking at the history of the ANU is how that research, policy, public contribution, scholarship kind of focus has been played out.
Yes, and I think that John Mulvaney is an excellent example of that, and Isabel McBride, and they did that important work at Mungo, but also in Tasmania. Like John Mulvaney was an activist who was, an environmentalist and so forth. And but one of the charms, I think, of the ANU was that it was small, and so that people knew each other across the disciplines. So you had geomorphologists talking to archaeologists and anthropologists, and you had this excitement of in the staff club, I think, that this wonderful exchange of knowledges which led to real breakthroughs. But I think the passion they had, somebody like John Mulvaney, absolutely brilliant, and Isabel McBride, she really changed heritage policy in Australia. I mean, she was involved in working with the New South Wales government on the first, was then called relics legislation, to protect Aboriginal artefacts from just being pilfered by anyone who wanted them. She did really important work, but when I first went to Lake Mungo and met the traditional owners, there was naturally suspicion because John Mulvaney and others had taken their ancestors' remains away, and there was great suspicion of people from ANU. And you just mention Isabel McBride, and the whole atmosphere changed, because her priority was always to listen to them, to respect their cultural values. And it was a game changer. It really changed heritage policy in Australia. And I think that a lot of this we don't necessarily appreciate. John Mulvaney also, terribly important in sort of the heritage, saving the Franklin. Actually getting Willandra Lakes classified as World Heritage was very much down to John. And yeah, so these people are very inspiring indeed. And even like I gave a lecture once, and Frank Fenner actually turned up, such a gracious man, and he told me that he had gone to the Northern Territory and was quite shocked by the situation that Aborigines faced there. It must have been when he was quite young I think it was the 1940s or 50s, so it would have been very much in this beginning of ANU period. But he went with Arthur Boyd, the famous artist, and Russell Ward, who's another ANU alumni. He wasn't then, but he ended up doing a PhD at ANU. So you sort of think of the kinds of minds across disciplines, the scientists, the historians, the artists who were together and who had these strong associations with ANU. And, I sort of aim in our Centre for Deep History to try and revive some of that, and I'm not saying I'm the first to do it, but I think that is the way to expand disciplines, to create new disciplines, to redefine disciplines. I think that innovative, creative role is really important for ANU.
It's a brilliant point you make, and it's also an interesting observation you make about the size, the scale of it, the number of people here. ANU's obviously taken a decision to restrict its size rather than growing like some of the other big metropolitan universities, which is quite consistent really with those, or confluent with those original ambitions, and as indeed is the hope to really enrich the student experience and to make it on a par with the great, and more famous universities, Harvard and these kinds of universities. So that's obviously going to be a work in progress over many years. I'm going to invite a couple of questions from the audience now, and while I do that, I might just invite each of you to perhaps speak to a name or two of the people, and you've just done so, but feel free to expand on that. A name or two of some of the people that you think have really defined the 75 years. We've heard names like Frank Fenner, Coral Bell could be mentioned. There are so many great scholars. So if there's anyone that you think is worth, that stands out in your mind as a landmark person, then Genevieve, you go first.
Well, Anne said, and Genevieve's mother, so can I just name my mother? So
I think you should.
I would say in that 75-year history, my mother, Diane Bell, is actually a hugely important part of that legacy, right? So, I mean, Anne talks a lot about coming here in 1978. I came here as a very little girl when my mother was a vacation scholar. She'd gotten into Monash with Whitlam's liberalisation of the economy. She came here as a vacation scholar at the end of her undergraduate degree, and I think had a moment not unlike yours, Anne, of seeing an extraordinary panoply of remarkable figures in Australian anthropology. For me as a little girl, it was just buildings and buildings and buildings full of tea rooms and iced Vovo biscuits, which seemed very luxurious, and a collection of extraordinarily generous human beings. Isabel McBride, Di Barwick, John Mulvaney, Derek Forge, men whose offices I remember mostly for the smell of them and for the photocopier that they let me play with, and endlessly Nugget Coombs. One day I'll tell you about him taking me 10-pin bowling in Alice Springs, because everyone should have that story. But I think about the arc of my mother's intellectual career. So here is a working class kid who has a job before she finishes high school, ends up coming back to university because of changes in government policy in Australia, comes here for a PhD, and for her this was a place that made possible an intellectual trajectory, but it was also a place, because of all the people that were here, that encouraged that it wasn't just about scholarship. It was about making your scholarship matter. It was about the fact that the work had to be in service of more than the work itself. It should be in the service of creating enduring, lasting change. It was a place that made it possible, although not always easily, for her to be a parent of 2 small children and a single mother in the 1970s and finish her PhD and go on to do kind of extraordinary work in those intersections. And I think of that entire cohort of women who were here then. Mari Ray, Mari Coleman, Di Barwick, Gloria Brennan, Marcia Langton, all of whom circled through this place. And I think that was a moment in time where all of the politics that Anne kind of was talking about where the women had been invisible, there was this moment where they became much more visible. And I think if this is a place that catalysed a great deal of that and made it possible, I also know for me as a small child, watching all of that, there was something remarkable about being in a place where it was about ideas. The ideas didn't stop when you left the classroom, though. They didn't stop when you left the lecture room. Those ideas continued to University House, and to I know which house you're talking about, and they continued to that house and many others that circled in the area, and where every conversation was a conversation about ideas, about a world that we were going to make collectively and radically. And I think about that as a thing I got to see as a 7-year-old child. And I can give you a panoply of people, but I think for me what was most important was it was those conversations, well, at least my encounter with the ANU as a little girl, was that it was all of that, right? That it was this heady place of ideas, but not ideas in the abstract. Ideas that were going to go somewhere and do something. And when I think about where I have seen elsewhere that being true, it is a very particular, special thing.
I must give an anecdote now about your mum, because one of...
Could you at least just call her Diane Bell? Like, my mother has a name.
No, I'm sorry. I'm bonding here.
But before you do, let me just say that we actually do have a microphone. I should have said that before. In fact, it was the microphone I was using to do the introductions, which got moved to there. So it would be very un-Canberra-like for there not to be someone coming forward at some point quite soon to ask a question. I think I'm being asked, do I need to give a COVID warning, don't touch the mic? I think I already did do that, but I'm happy to have now done it for, I think that's 3 times. Anne, away you go.
I'll probably get this wrong. Is Diane here? Oh no. One of her favourite anecdotes was that she was wanting to do her PhD and do field work in Aboriginal communities, and she was told, you cannot do field work with a child or children, or 2 children. And she said, okay, fine, I'll just tie them up to the clothesline and leave them and go. So
And the second version of that is she then said to this person who said, well, can't you just leave them somewhere? And she said, yes, I could leave them with you.
But then I was at a conference where Marcia Langton and Diane and myself took issue with something that was said at a particular paper. And we sort of ganged up, and from then on we were called the Feminist Mafia. So there you go.
We'll get you a T-shirt, Anne. I feel you should wear it proudly.
Indeed.
That's a really hard question. I'm going to answer it probably not in the spirit that you asked it, because I think the ANU is a really complex series of communities that's often had a lot of tensions running through it. And I suppose I just want to highlight, it wasn't an easy transition, certainly for those early figures to make, to a university environment, nor was it easy getting that balance right. So I suppose the 2 figures I want to mention are 2 early sort of architects of the ANU. One is Jim Davison, who really founded the Research School of Pacific Studies, came from a military, naval intelligence background, and provided enormously constructive advice to Pacific Island nations that were starting to come into independence and were framing their constitutions. That, however, was not regarded as academic work. And for him to be away doing that kind of highly constructive work greatly disturbed the University Council at the time. So in a way, at that level, Jim Davison was fulfilling one image of what the ANU should be, but at the same time not quite fitting the very specific requirements that an academic university was imposing. The other figure is a bloke called, now I've forgotten his name, Trevor Swan, who was arguably Australia's most eminent economist coming out of the Department of Post-War Reconstruction, Prime Minister's Department, so on. An enormously influential economic theoretician, regarded as the coming thing, not just in Australia but internationally. Many people regarded him as just having missed out on winning a Nobel Prize for one article that he wrote that was extremely important. So he's appointed to the ANU, and without really simplifying the story, Swan always struggled with being in a university environment, particularly a research-only university environment, because there wasn't that sense of practical application. He was an economic theoretician, but he was a long way away, in a sense, from the cutting edge of those issues. There wasn't much accountability, as opposed to Davison, who had a lot of accountability brought to him, because Swan was, in a sense, a captured figure, a great celebrity to have in a way. There wasn't a lot of accountability that came to him, and I think Trevor Swan really is an example of one of the casualties that not being able to fit into that really distinctive kind of matrix that the ANU was offering then, and has offered in each one of those its iterations has offered. So I know that's not quite the spirit. They're not heroes in a sense for the ANU, but they are emblematic, I think, of the really distinctive kind of delicate bargain that the ANU has always had to strike.
On the contrary, Nick, I think that is right within the spirit, and it's a good example of why we have panels like this and why we have institutions like this, because there are so many perspectives and there is a lot more than just what sits at the surface. And I think the diversity of your answers just to that question alone have been really rich, and I think a great exemplar of the institution itself. Let's take a question here, if you don't mind just saying your name to begin with, and we'll take it from there. Yes.
My name's Brett Yates, and I'll spend part of this afternoon speaking to Trevor Swan's son. So I was at Tilapia in the 60s, as was Nick, as was Nick's sister, who was in the same year as me, as the same year as Richard Swan, the same year as my wife sitting here. And I'm in touch with Richard, so I'll pass on this experience. But my question comes from, I think maybe Genevieve mentioning about influence of the ANU on politics and the public service, being in Canberra and the national capital and the national public service. We have Mark Howden and his team, world leaders, world scholars on climate change. My question is, how much access does Mark and his people have on the government and the public service? I imagine they've probably got better access to public servants than whether, I'll name one person, Scott Morrison. You know, would Mark Howden have any access to Scott Morrison or cabinet? Is this a particular point in time where he's got more or less access? And how is it different today to 10 years ago, 20 years ago? Has the public service and politics paid more attention to academics in the past than at present, and what about the future?
There's a few questions there. Genevieve, I'm not sure whether you're in a position to answer the specifics about Mark Howden's access, but I think the general spirit of the question is, it really goes to that tension between being a scholarly institution with full academic freedom, rights of inquiry and so forth, but also having this servicing or advisory role with government on critical matters of policy.
Yeah, listen, I think there's a couple of threads to pull there, and I should do the whole Turner Primary, Lynham High School, Dixon College, if that makes Tilapia feel better for you. So I think it's worth remembering that one of the things that is quite different in the 75-year arc is that the places that are making significant impact on the world are no longer just governments and universities, but also thinking about the commercial world. And I think there's a little bit here about how we roll into this, a responsibility to also engage with large enterprises who are shaping these issues too. So I know, for instance, Mark, who runs the Climate Change Institute, Mark and I, well, actually, the last time I was overseas, I was with Mark, so in January of last year. And he was bringing the work that we were doing here at the ANU to the World Economic Forum and using that as a platform to drive that conversation globally. Because it turns out, if you think your way back to January 2020, so before the pandemic, but in the middle of the bushfires. So we did an event in this room probably at that time, and the smoke was so efficient you couldn't see the back row. So you'll remember that Australia at that point in time was on everyone's radar globally as fire, wall-to-wall fire. And when Mark and I were in Switzerland together, one of the things people kept asking all of us was, tell us that everything's okay. And I think what they desperately wanted to be told was we weren't their future. And you only have to look at what's happened in California to know actually we probably were their future. And I think Mark used that opportunity to drive the data and the point of view that he and his team were creating here into a very large audience. And part of what ends up happening in those places is you have people from the rest of the world asking Australia about what's going on, and it creates pull through there. I also know, as has been true for a number of years, that the Vice-Chancellor sits on the Prime Minister's Science and Technology Council, as do I, and our role there is to provide advice to government, including Scott Morrison. And part of the advice we are routinely giving there is drawing on the work that happens inside this university and ensuring that those voices get heard at the cabinet level. Now, is it the case that there is more work to do there? Yeah, absolutely. Is it always hard? Because I think the one change I will say, having only been back in Australia for 5 years, but having watched it from a distance, is that our tolerance in public discourse for complicated arguments is far less than it once was. And it's a little hard to sustain an argument that is more than one thread deep. And so I think one of the challenges we often have as scholars, I don't think it is about academic freedom per se, it's I think about how we make our arguments intelligible and relevant to people who don't come from the same place as we do.
And perhaps persuasive. But I suppose, I mean, I'd say in response to that, even though the question wasn't directed at me technically, but John Howard always used to say politics obeys the iron laws of numbers or arithmetic. And that is true. And the most primary set of numbers they care about are the numbers in the party room and the numbers on, on the opinion polls. So it's always a difficult exercise having influence, but one has to keep believing in the power of logic, of empirical data, of persuasion, and there are many people engaged in that process at the moment, and perhaps slowly but surely it's having some effect. We'll have one more question because I think we're probably over time already, but it's just been so fascinating. So I'll just ask you to be quite brief and our panellists to be quite brief in response. Away you go.
Okay, thank you. My name's Rachel Bale. I'm a professional staff member here at ANU. In terms of living history, if we have this panel, we know that we stand on the shoulders of giants, and you've articulated some of that. But if we had this panel in 75 years' time, who are the giants of the future? No pressure.
Oh, wow, that's a really difficult question.
Hopefully they're undergraduates at the moment here.
Can I backtrack and think about influence again? Because I think that a lot of it, we've got to be advocates of what we can offer, government and the commercial world, and it's not always easy. Like, I actually offered to point out the relevance of history to the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody, and there's no way those QCs thought it was relevant in the least, that. And yet now, it's, with more research done, it's transparently obvious that, that deaths in custody are related to a long history of violence and police action and policy and so much more. And of course, W.K. Hancock, the actual beginning of his book, The Short History of Australia, was actually called The Invasion of Australia. And yet when I worked for the National Museum around the time of John Howard and the Federation anniversary of 100 years, we were not allowed to use the word invasion, even though we had an Indigenous director, Dawn Casey. So it's like people do forget history. And I guess my point as a historian, I'm very biased. I think people should listen more to history. I mean, Bob Carr was interested in history, so he would actually speak to historians. John Howard wasn't at all interested. I did go to the 2020 summit, so poor old Kevin Rudd had a great opportunity to consult with lots of academics from different fields, but didn't seem to have a great long-term impact. But what we can do, I think, is rely on our colleagues to have our voices heard. And at the time, it seemed to be only economists who were being heard. So I went to the wonderful Bob Gregory, who's an outstanding economist at ANU and emeritus, and I said, look, they only listen to economists, and he's going, oh, Anne, that's absolutely fine. I'll introduce you to everybody in the government, and of course, Bob being very magnanimous and friendly, he did that, So I think we've got to work with our colleagues or people like Genevieve who do have these contacts and try and get our voices heard by promoting what we have to offer.
So I would have thought there was a different answer too, right? Which is that it's always really tempting to have a history told as a series of biographies, but I think you could also tell it as a series of ideas. So if we say 75 years ago, what were the ideas that ANU held dear? And we ask the question today of what are the ones that we could pull through? And my suspicion is that there's a couple of them, right? One of them is about climate change and sustainability and responsible growth. One of them is about truth and reconciliation and the statement from the heart. One of them is about what it means to think about a technological future that is actually a system. And I look at those and I say, it might be better if 75 years from now we were judged by the quality of our ideas and the way they shape the world rather than all the people who articulated them. Because I think, as Anne powerfully made the point, the problem with the people thing is that you end up with uncomfortable heroes, and whilst ideas might be uncomfortable too, for me there's something a little bit more enduring about the fact that they may scale and make a difference.
Nick, I'll allow you to...
I agree very much with that, ideas. But I'm also going to cop out in a way and say it is actually the students that we're teaching now. And I think one of the great things to have been involved as a teacher at the ANU over the period that I have is just to realise what a rich and privileged environment this is, and what a distinctive environment the ANU is now as the most residential university in Australia, with a really diverse undergraduate community, with the capacity, given I think the wealth of this university in that fusion of research and teaching, and that great point that Ian Chubb made about why should we research, why should we teach, why should we research what we don't teach, to make that really powerful fusion between the excellence that we have as researchers and the really innovative stuff we should be offering as undergraduate and postgraduate teachers, because we have resources to draw on. We have a really privileged but clever undergraduate community to work with, and there are various schemes to make that community more diverse, more inclusive, and I certainly welcome those. But that's where our heroes lie. And I suppose if I can make a quick segue, one of the great strengths about the living history that is about to be released is exactly that way in which it encourages all members of the ANU community, past, present and future, to be a part of that story. So it's not just a top-down narrative, but it is what it has meant to be a part of a really vital, often tense, changing university community.
I think that's a really great note to end on, particularly the point you make, Nick, about research. I was just reading the other day that a forensic analysis of the research funding behind what is now AstraZeneca, dating back to 2000, found that 98% or nearly 98% of that money was institutional money, was public sector money, was not private sector investment. And of course, a lot of that research was very theoretical to begin with, but it's resulted in a vaccine for a virus that even at this time last year was not necessarily known whether it would actually work or not. And it's an extraordinary tale, and you know, a great graphic reminder of the whole purpose of intellectual endeavour. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being here. Would you join me in welcoming thanking Nick Brown, Ann McGrath and Genevieve Bell. Now, it's my great pleasure to welcome to the stage Dr Daniel Oakman, who will actually launch the Living History Project. Daniel is a historian here at ANU School of History and was before that Senior Curator at the National Museum of Australia. So, ladies and gentlemen, Daniel Oakman.
Thanks, Mark. Can you hear me okay? Well, hello all. It's always a busy mix of emotions, I think, when you get to this stage of a big project. There's certainly excitement, a lot of relief, I must say, and a slightly nervous sense of anticipation about what will now become of it. And as the project has faced a number of challenges, as had the university as a whole over the last year or so. But one of them has been the kind of approach that we hope to take towards telling an anniversary history, which does seek to take a different path, which is perhaps best illustrated by a very innocent encounter I had a few weeks ago. Now, someone asked me how my website was going, but it was the phrase "my website" that actually stuck with me. And I will admit I was a little bit stressed at the time, but I thought, what did they mean by my website? And on one level, I understood what they were getting at, but I reminded them that the website was never meant to be about the work of one person. Somehow a lone oracle working away in his office would write the history and then upload this into the digital realm, as though simply uploading a written document to the website would constitute the best use of the digital space. Now, my career has been as a curator in museums, not universities, and I wanted to bring something of the collaborative and inclusive spirit that has characterised that work in museums to the history of the ANU. The other thing I wanted to do was build on the already fantastic work done by others here, the folks in ANU Archives and ANU Heritage. Now, without their work, I wouldn't be able to do mine. But my job, I thought, was to find a fresh way to capture the remarkable history of the ANU in all its richness and diversity. Now, before I talk a bit more about the platform, you can see the homepage up here, I just want to give a few quick thank yous. Developing the website has involved some incredibly fruitful collaborations right across the university. I can't thank everyone, but I do want to single out a few special mentions. Nick Brown for our many chats over coffee about the history of the ANU. ANU Archives and ANU Heritage. And I think it is, again, worth mentioning the vital role that those areas play, as does, I think, this web platform, in preserving and extending our experience of the ANU's past. Last but certainly not least, Emma Cupit, who provided research assistance for the project. When I was very often distracted by the administrative and technical challenges of this project, it was a source of great comfort to me to know that Emma was beavering away with perseverance and insight in the archives and with her writing. And without her work, much of the new content on display here would simply not be there. Now about the web platform. It's called The Spirit of Inquiry. The title, in fact, comes from a series of ceramic artworks by the artist Deborah Halpern. You may remember them. They were aligned the terracing of the amphitheatre in the old Union Court. But the phrase, I thought, nicely captures both the open-ended nature of research and teaching that goes on at a university like ours, but also the openness and inclusivity that I hope this project can bring to the university's own sense of its past. Now, the first part of the website, which you can see a small part of it here, takes a fairly familiar shape. Users can explore a number of feature pages that are arranged thematically. There are stories about the Indigenous history of the land on which the university sits, including some of the objects that were used in this place for thousands of years, which are now in the collections of the National Museum. There are timelines of key moments, films, photographs. Music lovers can remember the decades of performance at the ANU Bar and Refectory. You can also relive the live telecast of the Queen opening the R.G. Menzies building in 1963, which I can recommend watching that again. Users of the site can also ponder the transformation of the campus with this remarkable series of aerial images taken in 1965 and 2015 with this sort of nifty slide tool. Now there's room to expand these features as the project evolves. In fact, a feature that occurred to me, a slightly mischievous one, while I was listening to the panel, was thinking of something that actually unified or provided some solidarity to this often, sometimes fractious campus, and that was about parking. And that seems to me that something that has people have bonded over or complained about parking over many decades. The heart of the project, and what I think makes it truly different, is the ANU Explorer. Now here users can immerse themselves in a mosaic of content, stories, images and objects that in some way represent the history of the ANU. But these can only gesture towards the diversity of experience here. And in some ways the ambition of the Explorer portal is not what is here now, but what will be in the future. This is what I like to think of as a digital campfire, an organic and welcoming space where everyone in the ANU community and beyond can explore the stories, share them through social media, make comments, and most importantly, participate in the storytelling. Now, why did I settle on this idea? Well, the short answer is I think anniversaries are fabulous opportunities for people to come together, like we have today, but I don't think they necessarily produce the best history. And dare I say it, those histories can often be a little bit dull. Somehow, particularly around university anniversaries, they seem to lose the sense of the energy, the visceral energy that can characterise a university campus. And they miss the energy that comes from research, teaching and learning, and of course from a place that is full of youthful exuberance. They're often preoccupied with abstract ideas, they focus on generalisations, perhaps for fear of excluding people, and they are too interested in transmitting a certain set of ideas, less interested in receiving them. This project looks to turn that approach on its head. And fittingly, I think for a university for which difference has been central to its identity, this website is a turn from a more orthodox approach to anniversary history. But it seeks to ground the history in detail in the particular experience of the very people who helped make the university what it is. And in this way, I hope that it will build a more nuanced and textured representation of the past, one that is not centred on the singular narrative produced by a lone historian. And here, anyone with a connection to the ANU is encouraged to participate. We have citizen scientists, or why not citizen historians, at work building a new history of the ANU. Now, sometimes this is an uncomfortable space for big institutions. It's an experiment where we don't quite know the outcome. And sometimes that subject matter can be challenging. And I'm pleased that the university has been brave enough to attempt it. As far as I know, this particular method of history making and storytelling has not been attempted in the same way by another university celebrating their anniversary. Now, I've already mentioned that collaboration, I think, is always at the centre of good ideas, and I hope that this project will foster that spirit. And in difficult times, that sense of collective endeavour is more important than ever. I may be biased, but perhaps history is the best mode by which to keep building that sense of shared enterprise. This is some of the pages, content you'll already discover in the Explorer. This is how you can use the website, which I think is a very intuitive and easy to use platform. And you don't have to register to look at the content, but there's a very simple process to go through in order to participate fully, which I hope you will all be able to do. Now, while there is already a lot to enjoy here, we have more to go online over the coming months. So please keep checking in to see what's there. Which only leaves me now to officially press the launch button, we'll call it this launch button, and for my website to become ours. Thank you.
Well, congratulations, Daniel. I'm looking forward myself to be able to explore what is there and to see how it evolves. So that brings the end of what has been, I think, a really remarkable set of discussions, which I have had the chance to think and ponder anew how the history of our university should help shape what we do next. And I thank our panel and Mark as our MC for coming here. Thank you, everyone, for coming along today. I'll remind you that still a number of things going on at the university: space, climate change, art and architecture, tours as well. You can go through and ask people around if you want to have some advice on what to go do and see. You can also, if you look at some of the posters, scan a QR code, and that'll bring up the schedule for you. So enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. Thank you for coming along.